The last couple of hours have seen more dramatic events in the Battle of Bakhmut, with Yevgeny Prigozhin claiming perhaps the fastest advance, as far as I can tell, by the Wagner forces in Bakhmut for some weeks now. I gather that his claim was that the Wagner forces advanced a further 500 meters. He has also said that the territory in Bakhmut under Ukrainian control has now shrunk to just 600 square meters, which is probably true, and to my mind begs the question of whether one can talk about Ukraine controlling or holding Bakhmut at all. I am going to continue to indulge the fiction that Bakhmut still holds and is still therefore Bakhmut. I will continue to speak of it in those terms. But I want to stress again that the territory within Bakhmut that Ukraine still controls is now limited to a very, very small area indeed. And it appears to be covered entirely by Russian artillery, and that the Russians manage, the Wagner forces, undoubtedly will clear this area, this relatively small area, very fast. Now, there's been a number of reports about the nature of the fighting. There was an extraordinary, rather anguished video that was circulating yesterday from a Ukrainian soldier who has apparently been involved in the fighting in Bakhmut. He says that Bakhmut has fallen, and he seemed to be talking in essentially valedictory terms, giving the impression that he doesn't expect to live much longer, and that his comrades in Bakhmut, who are still fighting in this small area, don't expect to live much longer. I am going to repeat points made by several people, including Mikhail Valterson and also commentators on Slavyangrad, that it's important not to be excessively swayed by the rather anguished comments made by a single soldier in a battle, and perhaps things are not quite as fraught or as bad as this particular soldier said. Certainly fighting is still continuing. But before I deal with what's actually going on, going principally to Valterson to describe the specific events, I'm going to make one further observation. Yesterday, I read a report that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is estimating Russian artillery strikes in and around Bakhmut, not just in Bakhmut itself, but in the areas around where Ukraine has been attempting to conduct a counteroffensive, or at least a counterattack on the flanks. It's been estimating Russian artillery use to be at the rate of 25 to 30,000 rounds of shells a day. That is a significant uptick of what we've seen in recent months. And I even saw a report somewhere, which, by the way, I'm not going to be able to confirm, that overall, across the entire battlefronts, Russian artillery strikes over the previous day, or at least on any particular day, for the last couple of days, have been between 40 and 60,000 rounds of artillery used every day. Now, I want to stress again, I can't obviously verify these figures, and these do come from Ukrainian sources. But it would appear, if you believe these claims, that the level of artillery use by the Russian military has been back up to the sort of levels of 60 to 65,000 a day that we saw at the peak of the fighting last summer, when the Russian forces were clearing places like Popasnaya and then eventually Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. I understand that the peak rate, the peak day of Russian artillery use last year was a certain day in May, when the Russian artillery is believed to have fired around 65,000 rounds of shells in one particular day. Now, I want to make a number of points about this. Firstly, again, we see that Russia is not apparently short of shells. They're able to fire shells in enormous quantities when they have to. And the average of shelling that they do every day comes to around 20,000 by most accounts. Now, there have been suggestions that, from time to time, that Russian shelling goes up and down depending on the nature of the stockpiles, the size of the stockpiles, a topic about which, by the way, we are grotesquely ill-informed. We know very little about the size of Russian stockpiles, and we don't know anything at all about the levels of Russian shell production. We know that the minimum reports made in the West was that the Russians were producing around 3 million shells a year before the war. I've already discussed in an earlier program why the methodology used to calculate that could be flawed. It might have been substantially more than that. And of course, we don't know how many shells Russia makes since the special operation began. So we don't actually, it seems to me, have a precise idea of the size of Russian stockpiles. For example, if Russian production of shells was more than 3 million a year, perhaps half as much, 50% more than that, or even double that, then of course the Russian stockpiles might be much greater. And as I said, as we don't know what Russian shell production is, I think any attempts to try and guess sustainability of shelling by the Russians is problematic. But I do want to make one specific point, which is that the Russians do not and have never at any point in the war routinely fired, as far as I can see, 60,000 shells a day. That has happened on particular days when the fighting has been particularly intense. That was true in the summer, and that appears to be true now. It is not the case that this is the average amount of shelling that Russia was conducting at any point last year, or indeed at any point this year. What we do see is that the Russians, on an average day, seem to be able to launch many more shells than the Ukrainians can do, even when the Ukrainians try to surge. And when the fighting becomes particularly intense, it seems that the Russians are able to surge their use by multiples, if, of course, you believe these claims that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is making, which, on balance, I probably do. Anyway, let's now turn to what Valterson has been saying. As I said, I'm going to Valterson because he provides extremely clear, level-headed accounts of what is going on the battlefield, specifically in Bakhmut, and he has enormous degree of precision in what he says. There's been some suggestions, by the way, that he's getting secret information from various people. I'm absolutely certain this is not the case. He uses open sources. What he does is he's able to compare what the Russians and the Ukrainians saying. He looks at the various maps. And of course, he brings to this whole topic an expert eye, and that enables him to make a sounder appreciation of the movements of troops backwards and forwards than those of us who are not experts can do. But anyway, he gave a report. This was yesterday, and he described the fighting, the state of the fighting, and this was Actually, it was early this morning. This is what he said. He said, this is late last night, Bakhmut hasn't fallen yet, fighting continues. And he talks about the video that I talked about by the Ukrainian soldier. And he then goes on to say that the firestorm, that there is still a firestorm, in other words, intense shelling over the remains of Ukrainian Bakhmut. And he says that this shows that the Ukrainian soldiers are still putting up a determined fight despite an impossible situation and hellish conditions. And he also has provided videos showing Russian multiple rocket launchers, launching heavy strikes on Ukrainian defenses between Bakhmut and Ivanivska. And in fact, earlier in the day, he provided, this is yesterday, he provided other reports. He said that there have been heavy losses of Ukrainian troops. He said that the Ukrainians, as he said, confirming what Prigozhin says, they now control about 600 square meters of Bakhmut. And he provided some information about what's happened to the Ukrainian defenders. He said that when the Domino area fell, Ukrainian defenders retreated towards Khromovo. The remains of 5 Ukrainian battalions. Now that was, you start with that, battalion strength forces. Those would have been around 500-600 men when they were presumably first organised, perhaps 2,500 men in total. It looks as if those battalions have been reduced to very, very low numbers. As I said, I saw a Russian report which guesstimated the number of Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut, this was before the events of yesterday, just as 1,000. So we see how these 5 battalions have been reduced to remnants. And that gives us some idea also of the level of losses that the Ukrainians have experienced in Bakhmut. And then he goes on to say that 2 other Ukrainian battalions retreated to the forest lines in the direction of Ivanivska. So we see that the Ukrainians aren't always holding out to the last man. They're pulling back. 7 battalions he refers to here. If you like, if you assume we're talking about a Ukrainian battalion at full strength when it was presumably first organised at 3,500 men. We're now talking about remnants of these battalions. Massive losses. However, those are calculated, and he said that in the Tetris area, in the south, Ukrainian defenders seem mainly to be the remnants of 2 battalions, much special forces and foreign volunteers. There also seem to be some Ukrainian squads and single soldiers still continuing to fight in both the Nest, that's the citadel area, and the Domino area, though he says that these are all being cleared and that the brave warriors who will be well received in Valhalla, which is a point of view. I have to say I personally prefer a live soldier to a soldier in Valhalla, but that's, another matter. There's no doubt that these are some brave people. By the way, I've heard that most of these volunteers who are fighting are apparently come from Poland or Turkey. They're apparently some of the most determined soldiers that Ukraine still has in Bakhmut, but the Russians are heavily clearing them. And Balterson says that yesterday the Russians captured a third of Bakhmut that was still under Ukrainian control. Now, he's provided a further update of the situation as of midday today, and that's the one I'm going to come to. And he says that Bakhmut isn't captured yet, though Ukraine has admitted Russian advances. During the night, hard fighting took place between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Several buildings in the remaining area of our Ukrainian control in the Tetris area east of Tchaikovskaya Street has been taken, but the Ukrainian resistance remains fierce. And then he says on the western side of Tchaikovskaya Street, Russian forces continue to move south, clearing house after house. Fighting is getting closer to the final Ukrainian defense line in Bakhmut in front of the Ilius Stov hangar complex. And then he says it's difficult to tell how much longer this is all going to take. It partly depends on how long it takes the Russians to fully clear the Tetris area. And he says that the houses, and this is a complicated word, I don't quite know what he means by houses. I get the sense we're no longer talking about high rises, we're talking about brick houses. He says the houses have been transformed to veritable fortresses. Windows and entrances on the lower floors have been bricked shut, only leaving small openings for machine guns and no possibility to enter the house. Actually, much like medieval castle keeps, on the higher floors there are protected machine gun emplacements and sniper positions. During storming, hand grenades rain down on the attackers. The only way is to blow holes in the walls on the ground floor. And on that topic, by the way, there was a report which appeared in the Western media some days ago about how the Russians are increasingly using tanks in this area to blast holes on the ground floors of some of these buildings. In other words, they're doing exactly what Valterson says. And for the record, I've come to the view that these tanks are in fact tanks operated by the regular Russian army, not the Wagner forces, but they're obviously working together with the Wagner forces. And then Valterson goes on to say that the Russians could probably eliminate these houses fast by dropping a number of Fab 500 glide bombs on them, but that the houses wouldn't be usable for defense purposes for the Russian military in the future. My own view about that is that the Russian military are probably not particularly concerned about using these houses for fortified lines. More likely they're not using Fab bombs to blow up these houses, not because of considerations about the use of them in the future, but because the Russian Air Force is busy dealing with other matters. Why would they waste time blowing up individual houses in Bakhmut when the tanks that are deployed there are doing the job instead? And then Valterson discusses the further Ukrainian defense lines. He says between Bakhmut and Ivanivska, the Ukrainians have a number of defense lines. The main one is on the eastern outskirts of Ivanivska, but there are several more minor ones on the fields between Bakhmut and Ivanivska, situated along tree lines and some buildings. And the lines in the fields are constantly under Russian artillery fire, and I've just talked about the severe density of the artillery fire. Their main purpose is probably to slow Russian advances so Ukrainian artillery can get good targets in case of a Russian advance. And to finish his various summaries, he says that the Ukrainians are now starting to admit the extent of Russian advances in Bakhmut, that there's only this tiny area, about 600 square meters, still under Ukrainian control. Now, like Valterson, I'm not going to speculate too precisely as to how long it will take to capture this small remaining area, perhaps a day. I suggested yesterday or was it the day before, that it might all be over by Sunday, the end late on Sunday. And that seems to me plausible. But anyway, this battle definitely is coming to an end. Now, what about the Ukrainian advances on the flanks? Boris Rozhin, who is a very, very well-informed commentator about events, he claimed yesterday, and in fact again this morning, as I understand it, that the Ukrainian counterattacks on the flanks have now entirely stalled. Prigozhin, on his part, I understand, claimed that the Ukrainians have continued to make some ground to the north. He claimed that they've recaptured this tiny place, Sako and Vanseti. He might be right about that, as it is a very small little settlement. About 20 people apparently lived there before the fighting began. It's unrelated. It has no connection to the latest fighting in Bakhmut, and Prigozhin himself appeared to admit that once Bakhmut is taken, the Russians will have little difficulty recapturing all the ground that they have lost in these Ukrainian counterattacks, which of course begs the question of what the point of those counterattacks was. There doesn't seem to be any real doubt that the Ukrainians have suffered extremely heavy losses mounting these counterattacks. And if we believe Helmer, if we believe the Russian Defense Ministry, then the Ukrainian losses, dead or wounded, or perhaps just dead, might number in the thousands. And it all seems rather pointless, given that it doesn't seem to have even slowed the Russian advance in Bakhmut itself, the Russian capture in Bakhmut itself, that no important positions were captured. As I said, it does seem a huge waste of men and machines to capture open fields, drag armour and artillery towards tree lines, across open fields, exposing Ukrainian troops to withering Russian artillery fire, achieving nothing of any great significance. And I come back to what Larry Johnson and Boris Rozhin have said. It seems to have been done principally more for, if you like, public relations purposes, to impress Western sponsors, perhaps disappointed that the Ukrainian counteroffensive hasn't been launched, to keep the Ukrainian public on side once the confirmation is received that the town of Bakhmut has been lost, that Ukraine has lost this battle, which, just to remind everybody, President Zelensky told the US Congress that the fight for Bakhmut would be the moment of the turn of the tide. No evidence of that so far, not at the moment at least. But anyway, it could be that, as I said, this offensive is more about managing expectations on the part of the Ukrainian public and Western governments than anything else, in which case all I can say is it's been done at an extremely high price in Ukrainian lives. And on that topic, still no news for the moment of this Ukrainian offensive, the big Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye region. Russians seem increasingly confident now that they can successfully repel it. And the person who is presumably in overall charge of preparing for that offensive, General Zaluzhny, remains invisible. Now that could be that this is because he's busy working hard on planning this offensive. I mean, I don't necessarily exclude that possibility, but it is a fact that he hasn't been visible for some time now. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Prigozhin has now made comments about this. He suggested that Zaluzhny was in the area of Bakhmut, close to Bakhmut, at various points over the last few weeks. He said that the Wagner artillery forces were striking hard in that general area. He has again, in effect, refloated the rumours that Zaluzhny is either wounded or possibly even dead. My own view is that these are rumours. I don't think Zaluzhny is dead. I think if he was dead or severely wounded, we would have had confirmation of that by now. But anyway, it is interesting and suggestive that we don't see much sign of him at the moment. And I can't help but wonder why, and why General Syrski also seems to have gone to ground. We're not seeing very much of him either. Now, just to reiterate again, I doubt that the Russians, having captured Bakhmut, will then steamroll all the way to Kramatorsk, as I know some people think. I think the priority for the Russians, once Bakhmut has fallen, will be to consolidate. So they will probably aim to recapture all the ground that they've lost in response to these Ukrainian attacks. And then I think they will act to capture all these villages close to Bakhmut, Khromovo, Ivanivska, Bogdanova, the slightly bigger place, Chasov Yar, Orekhovo, Vasilyevka to the north. And then perhaps, possibly, they will push further west towards Konstantinovka, and they will try to capture that place, perhaps in order to break the line that Rogin is talking about, starting at Konstantinovka, going through places like Alexandrovka, Rai, other such places, which the Ukrainians might try to establish as a further defense line ahead of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And then I expect the Russians to consolidate. If they follow the pattern they have been following since October, they might even create their own defense lines, trenches, barriers, that kind of thing, which would negate the need to use fortified buildings in Bakhmut to defend Bakhmut once they've captured it, going back to what Valterson was saying. Then they would reorganize, consolidate, prepare for a further advance at some point in the future when they are ready, and that will be the advance on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. In the meantime, I suspect the Russians will also want to push forward in the north, finally taking Seversk, the last important fortified position on the so-called Zelensky line, and perhaps also pushing back towards Liman, conceivably Kupiansk as well, building up their positions along the Oskol River. Again, all of this in preparation for the final offensive in Donbass towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And though I don't want to push too far ahead, once Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are taken, which could take a long time, they're big places, the Ukrainians will want to defend them, though looking at the map, I suspect they're not as easy to defend as Bakhmut. They don't seem to be surrounded by settlements of the same kind of density that Bakhmut is. Once Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are taken, then the Russians are able to push on towards the Dnieper River. And once they get there, opposite Dnipro, to my mind, the most difficult period from their point of view of the war will be over. All that, of course, assuming that the Ukrainians aren't able to achieve some breakthrough in their offensive. But as I said, the Russians seem increasingly confident that that won't be the case. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. There was, again, very heavy Russian missile and bomb strikes right across Ukraine yesterday. This is now a continuous story. As far as I can see, no Kinzhals were used, but there was heavy bombing in Kiev, by the way, and little sign, as far as I can see, of Patriot missile systems doing very much in Kiev or in its environs, and also very, very heavy strikes by the Russians. Further east, but on the northern borders in the Sumy, Chernigov area. And given the amount of attention that the Russians have been focusing on this area, it does make me wonder whether eventually the Russians might not have some plans for a future advance in the Sumy, Chernigov area. The Russian media, by the way, is linking these heavy Russian attacks, which have also apparently involved Russian reconnaissance troops crossing the border, going deep into Ukraine, striking Ukrainian positions, apparently in conjunction with bomb strikes and things of that kind. The Russians have linked all of these attacks with that attack some days ago on that Russian air group in Bryansk region, which, as we know, over the course of which a Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 34 and a 2 helicopters were all shot down. And the general consensus, by the way, now appears to be that this was more a lucky strike on the part of Ukraine, largely perhaps the product of complacency on the part of the Russians, not guarding their positions along the border properly, not noticing the presence of Ukrainian air defense units there, it seems to have been more that than any fundamental change in the course of the air war. And on that topic, I should say that ample evidence that the Russian Air Force continues to be busy. They continue to drop glide bombs in across various parts of the battlefronts, just as they have been doing before that shoot down of those 4 Russian aircraft took place. Now, on the topic of glide bombs, a extremely helpful correspondent who's written to me many times and who's, by the way, from India, that's all I'm going to say about him, has contacted me explaining some things about glide bombs. And he's explained how, in fact, it is possible for heavier glide bombs also to go over significant distances. It depends very much on the speed and the height at which the aircraft that launches a glide bomb is operating. So if a glide bomb, say a 1,500 kilo glide bomb, is launched from a very high flying, very high speed aircraft, then it will glide over a longer distance than it would, obviously, if the aircraft was flying at a lower speed and at a lower altitude. And this obviously can compensate for weight. It's clearly an intricate and complex operation. And what this person did point out, and what I have also, by the way, seen in the US military media, is that the Russians must be regretting that a particular strike aircraft that they had been operating in the past until a couple of years ago, in fact, the MiG-25 Foxbat strike aircraft, not the Interceptor, but this is a strike aircraft, was apparently taken out of service by the Russian Air Force a few years ago. This aircraft can fly at 2.5 times the speed of sound with bombs, and it can fly at very high altitudes, and it would have been the ideal launch vehicle for launching heavy glide bombs over very long distances. This is an aircraft that has its origins in the 1960s. It was very much, as I, by the way, well remember, a aircraft that was extensively covered and commented about during the second half of the Cold War. The Russians took it out of service some years back. Perhaps they're now regretting that they did that. Conceivably, they would like to bring it back into service. I don't know whether any of them are still around, whether they're in flyable condition, who's to say. I will say, by the way, and on this topic, that there were also some reports a few months ago that the Russians have now carried out the first flights of their Sukhoi 57, fifth generation stealth fighter, which, by the way, also has a secondary bombing capability. This is not the Sukhoi 57, which has been operating for some time. This is the new version, apparently lightened and with a much more powerful and lighter engine. And this particular variant of the Sukhoi 57, which will soon become the main variant of the Sukhoi 57, there's some speculation that it can operate at speeds higher than Mach 2 without, in other words, twice the speed of sound, without using afterburners. Who's to say? Possibly. But I do wonder whether, in light of all this I've just been receiving about the use of the potential use of the MiG-25, whether just possibly the Sukhoi 57 with its new engine and with what is said to be a lighter and stronger airframe might actually have been the aircraft that is intended to replace the MiG-25 Foxbat in this type of capability. But anyway, regardless of that, it is not in service for the moment. Now that also brings me to what is going on in Japan at the G7 meeting, all the discussions that are taking place about the delivery of F-16 fighters. And there still seems to be some residual resistance in the United States to supplying F-16s, though I've just been listening to Jake Sullivan, and my strong impression is that at a political level at least, in other words, at the decision of the president, a decision has now been made that at some point soonish, Ukraine will start to receive F-16s. The United States now does seem to be agreeing to train Ukrainian pilots to operate F-16s. And the talk is that they're going to be given a stripped down, shortened training program of 4 months instead of the 18 months that some people believe they need, and that sooner or later, perhaps before the end of this year, we're going to start to see F-16s deployed to the battlefronts, though everybody accepts that they won't be ready for the Ukrainian offensive that we've been hearing so much about. Well, I'm going to say straight away, the Russians have already made statements criticizing this decision, warning the United States apparently against supplying F-16s to Ukraine. Sullivan has gone out of his way to say that the Ukrainians are given cast iron commitments that they won't use these American systems to launch strikes into Russian territory. But of course, as we know, the United States doesn't acknowledge that Crimea is Russian territory, so that does seem to open the way for strikes on Crimea. And besides, I personally wouldn't take these Ukrainian assurances at all seriously, as Jake Sullivan is saying. But the most important point about the F-16 is just like the Patriot missile and the HIMARS and the M777 and all of these other machines, the F-16 is not a wonder weapon. It is a fourth generation aircraft. It has been in service in various variants for 50 years now. It actually predates the MiG-29 that the Ukrainians have been using already. And I personally don't have any doubt that the Russians will have little difficulty shooting it down, and that seems to be also the consensus amongst US Air Force veterans also. They seem to be bewildered about the assumptions that have been made about this particular aircraft. And I would add that some months ago I saw a commentary by a Ukrainian pilot who has flown both F-16s and Sukhoi 27s. Sukhoi 27 is a big Soviet-era fighter jet. It's the predecessor of the Sukhoi 35, which is now perhaps the most important fighter jet in the Russian Air Force, at least the one operating over Ukraine. And he made it very clear that though he liked the F-16, he thought the Sukhoi 27 was a much better and more powerful aircraft, even though Ukrainian Sukhoi 27s, of course, date from the 1980s. They are former Soviet production aircraft. So, again, I think expectations about this fighter jet are being pitched far too high. And that, of course, doesn't even begin to address problems about where these fighter jets are going to be based, whether they're going to be based in Ukraine itself, what kind of logistics system is going to be created around them, all of those things. But as I've discussed multiple times, NATO strategists, or rather at least neocon NATO strategists, never seem to be particularly concerned about such things. Logistics, infrastructure, maintenance, support, these are problems that really don't exist or don't arise. The other day, I discussed a very interesting article, at least I thought it was interesting, by a neocon, at least neocon aligned former British Army officer, Mr. Ludridge, in The Guardian. And he was again talking about the fact that the United States has 2,000 Abrams tanks available. And he seems to think that Ukraine can be supplied with an unlimited number of Abrams tanks by the United States. He doesn't seem to acknowledge the enormous logistical and maintenance burden involved in operating these tanks in the kind of numbers that he seems to want. And of course, if such a commitment to set up such an infrastructure in Ukraine, or indeed even in Poland, were ever made, then it's difficult to see how NATO could not itself become directly involved in the war. The Russians would obviously attack that infrastructure, as they're now doing all over Ukraine. They're taking out ammunition dumps, logistics centers, fuel depots, all of those sort of things. They would do the same with Abrams tanks and facilities and F-16 facilities. And the only way to defend them would be if NATO itself were to send its own forces into Ukraine to defend them, and perhaps that's what people like Mr. Ludridge want to see happen. All I will say about that is that if that were to happen, we would be in the early stages of World War III, despite Jake Sullivan going out of his way to say at the G7 summit meeting in Tokyo that that is not what the United States wants to see. Which now brings me to the G7 meeting in Tokyo, in Japan. And before I do that, I have to reference again this extraordinary spectacle of President Zelensky traveling first to Saudi Arabia, lecturing the leaders of the Arab League, and then flying on to Japan to attend this G7 meeting. And we were told that his visit to Japan was secret, that this was all kept under wraps. I wonder, secret from whom? Because a couple of days ago, when President Zelensky was on his way back to Kiev from Berlin after his European tour, one which took in all sorts of countries. I mean, it started in Finland, went on to the Netherlands, then went to Italy. Britain was then another stopover. Then he went to Germany, where he was awarded the Charlemagne Prize. Then he went back to Kiev, and on his way to Kiev, on the Duran, Alex Christoforou, my friend and colleague, and I did a program in which we discussed how long Zelensky would stay in Kiev. We agreed that he'd probably only be there a few days. And sure enough, so it turned out. As soon as he was in Kiev, he was packing his bags and preparing to go somewhere else. First to Saudi Arabia, and then on to Japan. So, secret again, I ask from whom? But anyway, let's put all that aside. Why did he go to Saudi Arabia? Well, he went to Saudi Arabia, he attended the Arab League. He had, as far as I can see, minimal interactions with the Arab leaders, and he gave an extraordinary speech to the Arab League, which basically was a lecture telling them that their stance of neutrality in the war, which is one that they have all taken, is somehow unacceptable, that they all must support Ukraine. It was an extraordinarily hostile and aggressive speech, and one has brief pictures of the Arab leaders, including the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. You see them all looking stony faces, and Zelensky listening to him talking in that kind of way. And of course, Zelensky was received with great courtesy, as is always the case when foreign visitors visit the Gulf monarchies. It's very much part of the culture of these countries that visitors, that guests are treated with great courtesy. And as I said, Zelensky was treated with great courtesy. But I have to say, I got the impression that quietly, privately, the Arab leaders were very angry. One Arab leader made his feelings entirely clear, and that was President Assad of Syria. He is, of course, a Russian ally, and he walked out. Well, at least he didn't walk out. He didn't attend the meeting. The others did, but they don't seem to have been, as far as I can see, very impressed. So why did Zelensky go? He can't really have believed that he would manage to change Arab views about the war. Well, I'm going to go back to what I said. I think he went because he doesn't want to be in Kiev. And my understanding is that this invitation to Zelensky to come to Saudi Arabia was extended to him many months ago by the Saudis under intense US pressure. It was about the time when the Saudis were first cutting oil production, and the Americans were angry about it, and they were criticizing the Saudis for tilting towards Russia, and the Saudis sort of palliate this criticism by extending an invitation to Zelensky. And then suddenly they were informed that he was not only accepting the invitation, but that he was intending to gate crash the Arab League summit. And sure enough, he turned up, and as I said, the Saudis received him. But it seems to me that the entire purpose of that visit, apart from giving Zelensky some more television pictures, which he can circulate amongst his people in Ukraine and perhaps to Western audiences, that the main purpose of his visit was to prolong his trip away from Kiev by a further day. So he goes to the Arab League, he makes his speech, He goes to Japan, and then as far as I can see, he vanishes without trace, because we have statements from the G7 about unflinching support for Ukraine, about tightening sanctions on Russia. We've had the F16 decision. But to be very clear, none of that required Zelensky's presence. All of that was already in the works. Perhaps the F16 decision still had to be argued over, but we've been heading in that direction now for weeks, for months, ever since, in my opinion, the decision to supply tanks was made. So I don't think that this is something that Zelensky's presence was needed for. So he attended the Arab League, he attended the G7, essentially, so it seems to me, so as to keep away from Kiev. And why he's keeping away from Kiev, problematic, not easy entirely to explain, but the situation on the battlefronts is not going well. The offensive is being constantly postponed. Kiev itself is being bombed. Even the US admits that the Patriot battery was damaged, though it claims that it was repaired and that the damage wasn't that extensive. I've expressed my own skepticism about all of those claims and discussed them in previous programs. Anyway, there's all of that, and there's probably also uncertainties about the situation in Kiev itself, and we see that Zaluzhny and Syrskyi, the two top military commanders, have over the last couple of days or weeks, for whatever reason, made themselves largely invisible, which, by the way, means that Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief, seems to be getting a lot of attention. I'm going to just finish by this segment of this program about the war by saying that, bizarre as it sounds, I again got the sense from listening to Sullivan that he's trying to extend some sort of, I won't say olive branch, but signals to the Russians that the United States is indeed trying to find some way out, some sort of off-ramp to this war. And it wasn't so much in what he said, it was rather in the way that he said it, his emphasis, the American emphasis on trying to avoid World War III and perhaps avoiding some kind of prolonged war. And of course that brings me back to that Politico article that I discussed yesterday, the one about a politically palatable solution for the United States, one which would allow memories of the war in Ukraine to gradually fade away, one which would presumably open up the route for President Biden's re-election next year. Well, if that's so, we've had a stinging response from the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, the man who's always brought out to make the really tough remarks. He's clearly, the hard cop. He plays hard cop to Putin's soft cop. Anyway, he was out yesterday, all guns blazing, saying that he saw absolutely no reason for negotiations to settle the war at the present time. I said yesterday in my program that I couldn't see at all any logical reason why the Russians would be interested in freezing the conflict at the present time. Anyway, let's move on, because the G7 wasn't actually about the war in Ukraine. It was about what I strongly suspect remains the overriding concern, which is China. This is the thing, this is what is really agitating the Biden administration, the Biden White House, the United States government. I should say that, in my opinion, even the people who I call the realists in Washington, the people who want to see this war in Ukraine brought to an end as soon as possible, are not people I would call realists in any true sense, because their realism is expressed in the way that you have to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, because what the United States needs to do is to concentrate on the real enemy, which is China. In other words, this is more a battle in Washington between people who want to break Russia, the Blinken, Nuland brigade, and those people in Washington who want to confront China, the uniformed military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, General Brown, who's soon going to replace him, people like that. And Jake Sullivan sometimes tilts towards the one side, sometimes tilts more towards the other. The president, Joe Biden himself, I think has a visceral dislike of President Putin of Russia and a deep emotional commitment to Ukraine, which goes back some years now. I'm not going to discuss the reasons for it in this program, but I think ultimately that he is fixated with China as well. So the point about the G7 summit was not about Ukraine at all. It was about China. And rather than discuss what it said about China, the G7 said about China, I'm going to go and take this from an article in the Financial Times. And it's the lead article in the Financial Times as I write this. And of course, the Financial Times, as I've discussed many times, appears to be particularly close to the Biden administration. It's almost, you could say, the European newspaper in which the current administration uses to convey its opinions to the European public, or at least the elite European public. And the article begins, G7 issues strongest condemnation of China as it intensifies response to Beijing. And then it says the G7 has issued its strongest condemnation of China as the world's most advanced economies. It's an interesting comment. The world's most advanced economies. Is China not an advanced economy? Is Russia not an advanced economy? Just asking that question. Anyway, step up their response to what they say are rising military and economic security threats posed by Beijing. Criticizing China over everything from militarization of the South China Sea and its use of economic coercion. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment because that seems to me so bizarre. The G7 in a joint communique urged Beijing to push Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. The G7 members said they were seriously concerned about the situation in the East and South China Seas and strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. Now, that's a very interesting sentence because strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion appears to leave open the possibility of unilateral action to change the status quo by something which falls short of force or coercion, which might include, for example, recognition of the independence of Taiwan. And as if to emphasize the point, the Financial Times goes on to say they also called for a peaceful solution to the increasing tension across the Taiwan Strait. In peaceful solution, in conjunction with criticism of the unilateral actions to change the status quo by force or coercion. But as I said, giving themselves an opening to change the status quo through means other than force and coercion, perhaps by recognizing Taiwan's independence at some point. I mean, to me, I have to say that all looks a little bit like insinuation, the preparing of the ground, if you like, for a recognition of Taiwanese independence in the knowledge that that will provoke a military response from Beijing. It is inevitable. And then they go on to say that the countries stressed they were prepared to build constructive and stable relations with Beijing, but recognize the importance of engaging candidly and expressing our concerns directly to China. Well, that's fine. You know, we're all happy when countries express themselves candidly to each other. They should do that. But of course, they're never happy when Chinese diplomats respond. They do the same thing when they express themselves candidly about the actions of the Western powers. When that happens, that's referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy. Extraordinary expression, by the way. But anyway, that was the main point of the article in the Financial Times. But then he goes on to say that the increasingly tough stance on Beijing comes after 2 years of the US and Japan working with the other G7 countries to strike a harsher tone against China's military activity around Taiwan and its use of economic pressure. We'll come to that. And shortly, the leaders of Japan, China, France, Germany, Italy, the United States and Britain also warned of heightened uncertainty about the global economic outlook, pledging to remain vigilant and flexible in their macroeconomic policy as global inflationary pressure continues. But on economic policy towards Beijing, they said that their approach was not designed to harm China or thwart its economic progress and development. However, they would seek what they called de-risking. They say that is not the same as economic decoupling. In other words, they're going to decouple, but they're going to call it de-risking itself instead. They're going to try and operate independent supply chains, set up independent supply chains. How they're going to do that is unclear. And then they said that the world has witnessed a disturbing rise of incidents of economic coercion, and that they would create a mechanism to increase our collective assessment, preparedness, deterrence, and response to economic coercion, and would step up coordination on detecting and responding to economic coercion. Now, this issue of economic coercion by China must be the single most Orwellian statement the Western leaders have made, arguably since the end of the Cold War. Because who is primarily engaging in economic coercion at the moment? Well, China has used economic pressure on countries, and that there is no doubt at all, but on a far smaller scale than the Western powers have done. At this moment in time, the United States is engaged in an all-out economic war against Russia, one it is losing, by the way. It has sanctions against multiple countries. Indeed, the weight of US sanctions, Western sanctions, EU sanctions, is now so great that it's almost impossible, as I can vouch from comments I've had from various business people, it's almost impossible to conduct trade around the world in an efficient way any longer. And of course, China publicly says that it is opposed to unilateral economic measures, economic sanctions. It says that sanctions, and this is the legal position that China and Russia and many other countries, by the way, adopt. They say that sanctions can only be imposed by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, that unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States and its Western allies are illegal and have no basis in international law. A view, by the way, that I happen to know many international jurists privately, and sometimes not so privately, share. Anyway, all of this is all very interesting because at the same time as the United States has been making all of these extraordinary claims about economic pressure by the United States, by China, economic coercion by China. China itself recently published a long statement about economic pressure by the United States, and it is a very powerful statement indeed. It covers many, many topics. It talks about the sanctions the United States has been imposing, unilateral sanctions the United States has been imposing on Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, all sorts of other countries. It talks about the way in which the United States has used its domestic legislation to authorize it to impose secondary sanctions on all sorts of countries, which don't in themselves enforce US sanctions against whatever country the United States itself is targeting. It talks about the sanctions that the United States has sometimes imposed upon its own allies, of which, by the way, there's been an increasing number now. It doesn't talk about the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, by the way, which would be an interesting topic. But anyway, it talks about all of these things, and this has been a lengthy statement, as I said, published by the Chinese government, and published, by the way, for the Chinese government by the Xinhua news agency. And we've had a stinging statement also from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin, and it says, I'm going to quote his words. This is from the regular press conference given by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and Wang Wenbin responded to a question from the Xinhua news agency. We noted a report titled America's Coercive Diplomacy and Its Harm, published by the Xinhua news agency yesterday, on the same day as senior US government officials said that concerns would be expressed over what they call China's economic coercion in the joint statement to be released by the G7. Do you have any comment? And Wang Wenbin said the following: the US often accuses other countries of using great power, status, coercive policies and economic coercion to pressure other countries into submission and engage in coercive diplomacy. This is how the United States projects its own poor record onto others. The fact is, the United States is the very origin of coercive diplomacy. It is the United States and the United States alone which owns the copyright of coercive diplomacy. Coercive diplomacy has now become an essential part of the US foreign policy toolbox. The US resorts to all kinds of political, economic, military, cultural, other types of measures as tools for coercive diplomacy to coerce and bludgeon countries around the world for its own selfish interests. Victims to US coercive diplomacy are found across the world, with developing countries bearing the brunt of it. And then he talks about specific instances involving China. He says, by enacting the Chips and Science Act, the United States government forbids semiconductor companies that receive federal financial aid from making substantive expansion into China, forces allies into imposing export restrictions on China, and seeks to divide the global chips, industrial and supply chains. The United States uses state power to suppress China's high-tech enterprises and even intimidates countries into not cooperating with Chinese 5G suppliers. Not even US allies have been spared from such ruthless coercion. Companies such as Toshiba from Japan, Siemens from Germany, Alstom from France are all its victims. And by the way, the Xinhua, the statement about US coercive diplomacy published by Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, official news agency, goes into great detail about the US pressure on Toshiba, Siemens and Alstom. But to continue, if the G7 summit is to discuss response to economic coercion, perhaps you should first discuss what the United States has done to other members of the group. The report issued by the Xinhua news agency contains abundant facts and data to reveal the deplorable record of the United States in coercive diplomacy around the world. It shows that the hegemonic, domineering and bullying nature of US coercive diplomacy and the serious damage it does to countries' independence and development, to regional stability and to world peace. The report is worth a good read. China has no taste for coercion and bullying. We always take a clear-cut stand against hegemony, unilateralism and coercive diplomacy. We urge the G7 to adapt to the prevailing trend of openness and inclusiveness in today's world and stop carrying out coercive diplomacy or building small exclusive circles. Well, you may not be a fan of the government of China to see that they are making a valid point. As I said, to repeat again, I am not saying that the Chinese are entirely innocent of using economic pressure on countries. I remember about 2 years ago, for example, they were putting some economic pressure on Lithuania after Lithuania seemed to edge towards recognition of Taiwan, just as an example. But this is, as I said, a minuscule affair compared to the way in which the United States uses its various coercive economic mechanisms to try to impose its positions around the world. Now, I referred to Nord Stream, of course, before the bombing of Nord Stream 2, before the war began in Ukraine in February 2022. Way back whilst Donald Trump was in office, the United States was threatening to impose sanctions on European companies involved in building Nord Stream 2. And some of them were intimidated enough to pull out of doing that. And of course, we've had sanctions, as I said, on numerous countries, as the Chinese statement says, going all the way back to 1962 with Cuba, and in fact beyond that, far beyond that. And that really does make me ask the question, what is the United States thinking when it accuses China of coercive diplomacy? Are the US leaders so blind to the reality of their own actions that they accuse China of what they are doing, they themselves are doing to a far greater extent? Are they basically putting up two fingers to the world, saying, we can do this and no one else is allowed to? So if the Chinese raise their heads above the parapet even slightly and do just a little bit of what we're doing, well, that's unacceptable and illegal and must be punished and cannot be allowed? Or is it rather, and I have to say that this seems to me increasingly the case, that the United States is using the spectre of Chinese coercive diplomacy as to prepare the groundwork for an all-out economic war against China of the same kind as the one it has launched against Russia? That would be an extraordinary and disastrous thing, but I have to say that seems to me by far the most likely explanation, and it gives us a clear idea of where we're heading. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, get yourself the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And, well, that's me for the day, and more from me soon.